me go ahead and segue into our teaching time at this point. We've been in a series called Relationships on the Rocks, which maybe doesn't sound super encouraging at first glance, but we're looking at different relationships that happen throughout the book of Genesis, the first book in the Bible. And we're trying to learn some things from them that can help us navigate our own relationships without some of the snags that we tend to get caught up in as people. And Jeremiah mentioned we talked about fear last week, specifically how fear-driven decisions negatively affected Abram, who becomes Abraham, and everyone around him. And at first glance, his move from the southern part of Israel to Egypt during a time of famine, it sounds like just a logical decision, the right thing to do. But as we start to look deeper at Abram, we see his motives, and that's where some red flags instantly appear. He fears a lack of resources, and he fears for his own safety. And as a result, he becomes really self-reliant and really deceptive. And so when we see self-reliance cropping up and maybe even a tendency to start to deceive people, we need to look at our own relationship motives to see if fear might be driving that. He relies on his own wisdom. He assumes the worst possible scenarios, and maybe we get stuck in those whirlpools of negativity sometimes ourselves. And then he asks his wife to pretend that they're not even married. So he's going downhill really quickly on this. And as a result, he turns into a curse to everyone around him instead of the blessing that he's supposed to be. His wife gets mistreated, Pharaoh's entire household is harmed, and the only person benefiting from his decisions is Abram himself. And sometimes we need to be reminded that if we let fear drive our decisions, and it pushes us towards self-reliance and deception and mistreatment, it's going to harm the people in our lives as well. It's going to have negative impact on our relationships. That's what we talked about last week. And this week, we're moving into something else here, and that is self. Serving self, right? This is going to get a little personal today, perhaps, because we do, I think, a lot of things thinking of ourselves first. And we're looking at Lot, who is Abram's nephew, and he's along for the ride in a lot of these stories. He comes up every now and then. He's not always mentioned by name, but he's kind of always there, hanging on in the background. And the name Lot, it means clingy. Have you ever had people in your life that just have a tendency to be kind of clingy? Well, these names in the Bible often are descriptive of the character behind the people involved. And it means clinging thing, or like a burial shroud that just, is very form-fitting, right? And so he's always that person hanging around close to Abram until today in the story that we read about. We're also going to come across a town called Bethel. It's called House of God. It's this mountain town about 14 miles north of Jerusalem where Abram builds an altar. It's kind of his worship center for God in this new land that God has called him to. We also come across the name the Perizzites. It means the village people, not those village people, and not those village people. But it's talking about a group of villagers in that same area in central Israel. We're going to talk about the plain of the Jordan. It's this lush area of the Jordan River Valley. It looks something like this in the wet season. And we're going to talk about Hebron, which is another city in Israel, slightly further to the west and to the south. And the view from Hebron is a little bit different. It looks more like this. Okay? So be thinking about those contrasts in the story when we come to them. This versus this. It's going to play out. And somebody's going to be indulging themselves, and someone's going to choose to be a little bit sacrificial, which is maybe the model that we should emulate or imitate as a result of this conversation we're having today. So we're going to start out looking at some different arguments that are cropping up. And these arguments are starting because two people are very focused on themselves. How can I benefit? No, how can I benefit from this situation? It says in the story, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, so he has been in Egypt. That's where he was very fear-driven. He, his wife, and all he had, and Lot, clingy, is there as well, of course, right next to him. Abram was very rich. It literally says he was weighted down. We would say the guy was loaded, right? Now, weight isn't always a good thing, right? Sometimes it hinders us. And while I would love to be loaded some days with riches, and I'm definitely not, there are other sides of wealth that can really, really have a negative effect, can slow you in your tracks. And he has so much that it's impeding his ability in different ways. Livestock, silver, gold. He went by stages from the Negev to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai where his tent had formerly been. So he's going back up to worship with all of his stuff, to the site where he had built the altar. And Abram called the name of the Lord on the name of the Lord there. Now Lot, who was traveling with Abram, also had flocks, herds, and tents. So he was also very loaded with stuff. We've got two very rich, wealthy people with lots of stuff. It says, but the land was unable to support them as long as they stayed together, for they had so many possessions they couldn't stay together. Literally in Hebrew, it says they couldn't become one. Have you heard that phrase, the two become one, before in Genesis anywhere? Where did you hear that? In the garden, right, with Adam and Eve, right, the first humans. And that was a good thing. It was a human was split into two so that the two could become one. There's another scripture in Psalms that says how blessed it is when brothers and sisters live together in unity. And that's kind of the idea here. It's great. Isn't it great when you're in a relationship and both of you seem to be on the same page? You have conversations, you're connecting, you can be unified. But this relationship is not that way. There's conflict, and all the conflict is being caused between these two relatives in large part, by all of their stuff. They've got so many riches that they're running out of resources and they're running out of room. They can't exist together. And maybe there are things that we're doing to indulge ourselves that are creating this climate or this environment that's making it really hard to be unified with other people. It may not be wealth. Maybe it is. Most of you don't have the luxury of being burdened down with that amount of wealth, maybe. But maybe there are other things that get in the way, and they cause strife and conflict between us and others, and they make unity very difficult. We already mentioned they're weighed down by stuff, and they can't live together in unity. That's how they're being affected by this. Quick question for you, and you can feel free to respond. How did they get to this point where they have ridiculous amounts of wealth? How did they get there? What do you think? Some of it maybe we know, some of it we can speculate, but how did they get to this point?
They were blessed.
Okay? God said, I'll bless you in different ways, and he did. Okay?
Part of it was his deception to
Oh,
Pharaoh.
yes. Part of it was his deception to Pharaoh, right? He said, this isn't my wife, this is my sister. And Pharaoh said, well, that's great. As the older brother, I'll pay you a huge dowry for your beautiful sister so she can become my wife. And Abram said, all right, I'll take it. And so he got more slaves and more wealth, and he was loaded. He was already doing well for himself. God had already said, I'll bless you. He was already 75 years old, so he'd spent his life maybe working or accruing or inheriting things, right? He had a base of wealth, but then when he went to Pharaoh and he deceived Pharaoh, he gained a lot more wealth, right? And so he did some shady things to get that. And maybe we think wealth, that's the number one pursuit. That's what I should be following in life or trying to accrue in life. And if I have that, I truly have life. But yeah, Abram truly had problems. But that's kind of how he got there to that point. Again, we talk about arguments. So this is how all of that stuff and all that lack of room and resources plays out. It says, and there was quarreling between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, villagers, were living in the land. So Abram said to Lot, please, let's not have quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, since we're relatives. Like, this is not good for our relationship. We shouldn't be quarreling, right? It had turned into a rivalry, right? What once was a relationship now is me versus you. They're arguing over space. And this is kind of how this maybe would have played out culturally. The herdsmen are getting in conflict, but it's not just the herdsmen, it's Abram and Lot. It says both groups are arguing. The shepherds are arguing, and then Lot and Abram are arguing as well. So it's affecting everyone. And part of it is just, this is my space. No, this is my space. When you're living in a high desert, as we are, and as it was in ancient Israel, there's not a lot of great grazing areas, and so you're all forced into the few areas that have enough food for the livestock. And so there's literally not enough space, so they're arguing over that. They're also arguing over status, because in this environment, at this point in time in history, in these cultures, the older family member, which would have been Abram, was always supposed to get the right of way. And so if there was better grazing area, because of the way their honor, shame, and status culture worked, it should have been the right of Abram to let his flocks graze in the better spot. So this is creating conflict, not just because there's not enough room, but because it's like a lower person versus a higher person status-wise, and whose flocks get the best area based on status. Also about stuff. Can you imagine having tons of herds of sheep crammed into a small area? Do you think any sheep perhaps got mixed up, maybe ended up in the wrong flock, right? Maybe shepherds have this uncanny ability to tell their sheep apart, and maybe some tricks so that the sheep follow them and things like that. But I cannot imagine a world where some of these sheep, these possessions, did not get intermingled. And so now you have fights over whose stuff is whose stuff. We all have a lot of stuff, but what's yours and what's mine? And then there's maybe shortfalls. That sheep caused, some damage. That wasn't my sheep. That was your sheep. You're responsible for paying the damage that sheep caused. And so you have all these different conflicts that are entering into the relationship, and it's becoming more of a rivalry than enjoyable, unified relationship. Okay? So I went a little bit too far there. Okay. Question. Statement, I guess. When we focus on self, if we focus on self, a lot of times it causes rivalries in our relationship. How does it play out for us? I mean, when's the last time you had a fight over your sheep and your neighbor's sheep? Never, right? However, maybe we insist on choosing restaurants or movies or weekend plans based on our personal tastes instead of our partners or our families, right? It becomes, what do I want to get out of life? What do I want to experience? What kind of food do I enjoy, right? What do I want to do? Not about someone else. Maybe we spend our time on personal hobbies or projects, and we enjoy it, but we neglect time with the people in our lives. And as a result, they feel kind of rejected, whether or not they express it. But really, it's a focus on self, and it's created kind of conflict, a rivalry in a relationship. Maybe we consistently come home late from work, and we leave our partner juggling our kids or dinner or things in our home. Maybe we talk about our own day and our problems and our successes. We love to give downloads to people, but we never ask other people how they're doing or about their struggles in life. Maybe we dismiss other people's emotions with statements like, you're just overreacting, right? It's all about our point of view, ourself. Maybe we spend money impulsively on our wants without collaborating on purchases and financial goals or savings, right? Well, I wanted to spend money on that, so I did. Or, I'm the one who's earning more money here, and so I feel the right to do that, right? Without consulting someone else, because I'm the one who worked for it. Maybe we expect affection or attention when it's convenient for us, but we ignore our partner's needs, and that causes arguments. Maybe we always need to win arguments, and we're not very good at compromising. All these are ways that we can tend to serve ourselves, just like Abram did, just like Lot did, and that ignites conflict, and it creates more of a rivalry than actually a good relationship out of it. Secondly, I want to talk about advantages, because when we think about ourselves, oftentimes we want to be the people that get the advantage in the situation, right? It feels great to be the one who has the advantage, and sometimes it doesn't feel great to be the one that's, we would say, disadvantaged in some way. But if we're going to exist in unity, there are times when we have to humble ourselves and we have to give the advantage to other people. And this is something that Abram does here. And it's the only way really forward. It's the only way to end this cycle of conflict that's happening. It says in verse 9, this is Abram talking. He says, "Isn't the whole land before you? Separate from me. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." So Abram here, who has the status, could say, I'm the patriarch in this situation. I'm the older male in the family. It's my right to go here, and you go wherever, but I'm going here, and you have to submit to me. He doesn't do that. And this is a guy who definitely has his own struggles, right, with selfish living, because we talked about deception. That was mentioned just a moment ago. That's how he got his wealth. So he has a lot of issues as a person, right? But in this situation, he lowers his ego, and he actually serves Lot who again, culturally doesn't have the status that he has, by putting Lot's desires first instead of his own desires first. And that's how we really step in and break this cycle. Abram's actions here are going to end at least this cycle of selfishness. Doesn't mean that the cycles won't erupt in other ways later on down the line, but at least with this issue at hand, Abram's choice to serve Lot, put Lot's desires first, is what's going to, again, move past just this serving self that both of them are deadlocked in, are gridlocked in. Also, when you look at the Bible, see how he says, if you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. This is just kind of for your information. Doesn't really pertain to the meaning of this story, but you'll see it over and over again throughout the Bible. When we look at a map in our culture, we're oriented toward north, right? Primarily because compasses orient us toward north. And so we navigate, we're thinking, well, where's north? Or we look at the North Star, and that's our frame of reference. If you're in ancient Israel, your frame of reference is not north. Your frame of reference is to the east, facing the east. And so when you say, if you go to the left, I'll go to the right, you're saying, if you go north, I'll go south. If you go south, I'll go north, right? And so you're going toward the east, or you're going away from the east, or you're going to the left, the north, the right, the south. So again, directions in the Bible, people think differently in different cultures. This is just one example. And so as you read the Bible and you see, well, left, right, isn't that arbitrary? No, it's actually north and south, just FYI. So in verse 10, Lot looked out. So he's, again, oriented toward the east, and he's looking out. He saw that the entire plain of the Jordan, as far as Zoar, was well watered everywhere, like the Lord's garden, like the Garden of Eden, and like the land of Egypt, because there's a huge river called the Nile, right, that provides a lot of water for growing in that region. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So just a footnote. If you're reading through Genesis, that'll come up later. So Lot chose the entire plain of the Jordan for himself. Notice those adjectives, right? The entire, okay? Now, and then he journeyed eastward, right? And they separated from each other. And so Lot looks over and he sees this, and he's like, you know what? I'm going there. Uncle Abram, he told me. He gave me the choice. And so since he's willing to give me the choice, I'm going to seize the best. I'm going to take that entire land for myself, right? It's me first. He's serving himself. And unfortunately, when we give other people the right of way, we let other people go first, sometimes they'll take advantage of us. And that's one of the risks that we just kind of have to open ourselves up to sometimes. Sometimes when we do the right thing, other people will intentionally run over us. And it still doesn't mean that it wasn't the right thing, because Abram's thinking in terms of relationship, not in terms of just wealth and possessions. So Lot chooses this, which gives Abram that other picture that we talked about toward the beginning. I'll show you again in a moment. It says, Abram lived in the land of Canaan, but Lot lived in the cities on the plain in all that lush area and set up his tent near Sodom. It says, now the men of Sodom were evil, sinning immensely against the Lord. So as we read through Genesis, we encounter stories and we realize that these men are very sexually abusive and very violent. Okay? So we're going to come across that later. And sometimes relocating near the center of prosperity, it actually becomes a snare, because it's even more stuff focused, right? And I was talking to somebody about this a couple weeks ago. Areas that are lower income have their own problems, and areas where people have more than enough have their own problems, right? Just because you have an abundance of possessions doesn't mean you lose the problems. They just change. We're humans. We always have problems everywhere. And so with a lot of affluence and a lot of assets, there are just as many problems as with nothing. It's just the problems change. And so these are Lot's new problems that he inherits based on that choice. So God's going to step in here, because you can imagine if somebody just took advantage of your offer. I mean, wouldn't it have been nice for Lot to say, I'll head to the north, and I'll take part of that lush plain down there. Maybe let's divide it in half. You can have the other half. You can have the other half of that plain, and you can head south, right? But let's share this. Let's both benefit from that. That wasn't what Lot did. And so God comes along to kind of, I think, console Abram and say, you know, You did the right thing. It says, after Lot had separated from him, the Lord said to Abram, just look from the place where you're at. Look north and south and east and west, for I'll give you and your offspring forever all the land that you see. So he's on a high point, right? God's like, I've promised you all of this. I know Lot, he took the best part of it right now, but think about what I've promised you. And it may not play out now. It may not even play out in your lifetime, but just know that I have good things. I have good intentions for you, right? I'll make your offspring like the dust of the earth. So if anybody could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring could be counted. Get up and walk around the land through its length and width, for I'm going to give it to you. And so God sees Abram's humility in this moment because Abram's not always humble, right? But he promises to reward his selfless actions. And I think God takes note when we humble ourselves and we act on his behalf. We treat people like God's kingdom would treat people, with God's value system instead of our own worldly value system, what the world values, right? And we act like God's people and God's representatives in this world. And so God stepped in and just said, that was the right thing. It was selfless. And just remember, I've got good things and good intentions planned for you. Don't forget who I am. You can trust me. It says, so Abram moved his tent and went to live near the oaks of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. So Abram, he settles for less, actually, in this situation, because he's served the other person, right? He gave him the choice. So he settles for less, and he finds contentment. He actually worships God and says, thank you, God, for your promises. He doesn't sulk. He doesn't get resentful. He doesn't send his servants after Lot's servants and say, hey, man, you're a jerk. Like, why did you choose that and leave me with nothing? He just focuses on God. He worships, and he thanks God for the place that he has, which is this. There's a lot of beauty in a dry land. You all live in one, so you kind of know that, right? But there's also challenges and hardships. And when you compare it with some lush paradise, it doesn't always add up. But Abram finds contentment here. Here's how I want to leave you with the challenge, and then we'll turn our attention toward communion this morning. If you saw, we have the bread and the juice up here today, and we'll focus on our attention toward Christ as we close off today. But I want to challenge you to think in terms of how you can give someone else advantages, because that's really the solution to serving ourselves, is putting other people first, right? That's what Abram does, and that's what God rewards, and God compliments. So how can we give other people advantage? By putting their interests or their needs or their desires first. Because sometimes we just get in this struggle of myself versus yourself, and it does wreck our relationships. One thing we might try doing is just listening first instead of giving solutions, or instead of just telling people what we're going to do. It just is simply listening, closing our mouths and letting someone else talk first, listening. Sometimes it's practicing empathy, trying to step into someone else's shoes and ask ourselves why somebody is feeling what they're feeling or expressing the emotions that they're expressing, right? Sometimes it's just looking for small, simple ways that we can serve somebody else in our lives. It doesn't have to be huge. Maybe we could ask what matters most to someone else. Here's what, I've been focusing on my projects, or I've been focusing on spending money on these things, and it never dawned on me till I was in church last week or listened to this sermon on YouTube at this Mountain View Bible Church, that maybe I should ask you what you want. What do you want to get out of this life together? Maybe it's compromising generously instead of a compromise that's 50-50 or maybe like 75-25 in our favor. We give that other person the 75, or like Abram did, even the 100%. But we're generous when we look to compromise. Maybe we're seeking other people's growth. What would allow this person to investigate their interests, or to grow as a person, or to live a life that they feel is fulfilling, not just the thing that's going to further me and my desires? Because in relationships, right, we only have so many resources and so much time, right? And you can't devote it all toward one person, or it's really off balance. Maybe it's pausing ourselves as we try to defend ourselves. I know that's something I got to be careful about. I don't want people to think bad about me, and sometimes I get defensive too fast. Maybe it's giving grace to someone, even though we feel like they don't deserve it at the time. Maybe it's celebrating other people's victories, their successes in life, instead of just being, oh, that's nice that happened for you, and then just move on. How can we take time out to really celebrate this achievement in your life? Maybe it's sacrificing our own comforts, again, because we want to live a comfortable life, but that's very self-focused sometimes. Maybe it's even prayer. Turning to God and saying, I want to begin to pray about my spouse's needs, or my kids' needs, or my good friends' needs, right? God, show me what they need and help me to be there and be more selfless and to give more attention to their, again, interests, needs, and desires. Those are all ways that we might move forward on this personally. Those last points are in your bulletins if you picked one up on the way in, or if not, they're on the table on the way out if you'd like a reminder of that. But all this is just serving others instead of serving ourselves. That can pave a much better way forward in our relationships.